Welcome back. This is our first video for our fourth unit on cells. So what exactly is a cell? Well, when scientists first observed these things under a microscope, there wasn't really much to see because of their primitive technology, their simple microscopes. And so they named the cell after the rather drab, boring rooms that monks and monasteries lived in. Now, as microscope technology improved, scientists were able to observe a lot more inside of a cell. But we've held on to that term ever since. So the cell theory, right, kind of sets up our foundation for understanding cell biology. First and foremost, every living thing is either made up of a single cell or multiple cells. And that's something that we talked about way back in the beginning of the semester with the 8 characteristics of life. Organisms can be either unicellular or multicellular, the simplest collection of matter that can be considered alive. So I am a multicellular organism. I'm considered alive because I meet all 8 characteristics of life. Now, if you were to take one of my cells and separate it from my body, believe it or not, if you took a sample of my skin cells or some other cells, they would meet a majority of those 8 characteristics, or in some cases, almost all of them, right? And so the individual cell at that point could still be considered alive. And then all living cells arise by or from the division of pre-existing cells, right? And so where did Mr. Collins come from? Well, believe it or not, at one point in my life, I was a single little cell. And that single little cell was the result of the fusion of 2 smaller cells. The sperm cell from my father and the egg cell from my mother. They came together, they fused that first single cell. And that one cell continued to divide and to divide and divide and to divide, and here I am. Now, we could trace those initial cells, the sperm cell and the egg cell, back to my mother and my father. And where did they get their cells? And we can go back to our grandparents and so on and so forth, right? So, our cells are the result of the division of pre-existing cells, right? We kind of inherit them from our parents, per se. And then all cells are going to contain DNA, right? The instruction manual for life. It's kind of our cell's cookbook for proteins. Now, although all cells are different, both function and shape and structure, there are some things that all cells have, right? It's kind of what inherently makes them a cell in the first place. And the first one is the cell or plasma membrane. Okay, and this is a semi-permeable layer that separates the inside of the cell from the outside. And sometimes we refer to this as the intracellular fluid or intracellular space and the extracellular space. And so the plasma membrane separates those. Now, inside of the cell membrane, we have a jelly-like fluid known as the cytoplasm. Okay, and we'll talk about what that serves here in just a little bit. Now, floating around in the cytoplasm, we might also find ourselves some DNA, right? And that's the cookbook or the instruction manual for our cells. And then you're going to find ribosomes, right? And ribosomes can be floating around in the cytoplasm. They can also be stuck to other surfaces, okay? And the ribosomes are little protein factories, right? So they can make enzymes and other structural proteins for our cells. But it doesn't matter what kind of cell we're talking about. It's going to have all 4. Right? Now, there are some exceptions to the rules, but for the most part, we're going to generally accept the fact that if we're talking about a cell, it's going to have these 4 things. Now, again, when we're looking at an organism, we first need to decide, is it unicellular and multicellular? And this is fairly easy to distinguish, right? And so if it's large enough for you to see with your naked eye, it's probably going to be multicellular, right? Such as myself, your dogs, your cats, the trees outside, the plants in your garden, the mushroom that's growing up out of the mulch in your front yard. Those would all be multicellular organisms, right? And we could slice them up and study all the individual tissues and all the different cells and cell types that are found in that organism. But there are also a lot of unicellular organisms, and most of these are too small for us to see with our naked eye. We need a microscope to view them, and a lot of these can be found in water, right? They kind of like aquatic environments, whether we're talking about freshwater, brackish, or a marine environment. And we got some examples here, like the paramecium and amoeba, which you will see in class when we start performing our freshwater microscopies and start looking at samples. You'll see these guys swimming around, and each individual cell is its own organism, right? So this individual amoeba right here contains everything it needs to survive. And then bacteria. Now, we won't be able to see these very well with our microscopes because these guys are really tiny. They're also unicellular, containing everything it needs to be its own standalone organism. And then here we have our yeast. And we talked a lot about yeast when we were discussing alcoholic fermentation. This is a unicellular fungus that's of quite importance or significant importance to humans. Now, if something is unicellular, we can take it another step further. If you're looking at a unicellular organism, another consideration to take into account is whether it's prokaryotic or eukaryotic. So unicellular organisms could be prokaryotic or they could be eukaryotic. And I will talk about some ways in which you can easily distinguish between the two. But if you're looking through a microscope, the prokaryotic cell is going to be really, really small. And the eukaryotic cell is going to be a good bit larger. Now, in regards to multicellular organisms, all multicellular organisms are eukaryotic, right? So when you look at animals and plants and larger fungi, they're all going to have eukaryotic cells. Really, at the end of the day, when it comes to unicellular prokaryotes, we're really only talking about bacteria and archaea. So let's talk more about the prokaryotes. When you see this word prokaryote, I want you to think no, the no-karyotes. It's because they don't carry a lot inside of them. When you look at them in a microscope, they look almost empty or they just look rather simple. And so I think prokaryote is the no-karyote. There is no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles, right? So there's not a whole lot going on inside. Now, that's not to say that these organisms are not capable of incredible feats, right? These organisms can be found all over planet Earth in places that eukaryotic cells couldn't even begin to dream about existing in. Now, they do have some interesting unique characteristics, right? So no nucleus, no organelles, and their DNA is circular, right? And in the main chromosome, main piece of circular DNA is kind of found in something known as a nucleoid region, right? So it's not quite a nucleus, right? But it's still going to be hanging out in the middle. And then DNA have these crazy smaller circular pieces of DNA known as plasmids. And prokaryotes can do a lot of crazy things with these plasmids, and these plasmids have a lot of importance in biotechnology. We'll talk about that later on. And you can also see that they've got some extra cellular material, right? Things that are on the outside of the cell that make them quite unique. Another really wild thing about prokaryotes is their ribosomes. Now remember, all cells have ribosomes, but their ribosomes are slightly different than eukaryotic ribosomes. Prokaryotes have 70S ribosomes, and that's just referring to the size and shape of the structures, right? Because at the end of the day, ribosomes are going to be responsible for the same function, and that's making proteins or protein synthesis, but their ribosomes are slightly different, and we call that 70S. Now, what are some unique characteristics or easy ways to think about them is prokaryotes tend to be a lot smaller. They tend to look far more simple than eukaryotes, right? When you're looking at this, and if I said, all right, guys, you got to study this diagram and take an exam on it tomorrow, you'd think, okay, I can do that because it looks simple. And then the prokaryotes are going to reproduce asexually. In fact, bacteria use what is known as binary fission, right? Fission is division. So these small unicellular prokaryotes would simply get a little bit larger and then split in half, producing identical copies of themselves. And so what are some examples of prokaryotes? They're going to be your bacteria and your archaea. At one point, these guys were lumped together, right? And they were all considered to be the same type of organism under this lump category, prokaryote. And believe it or not, a lot of modern scientists are slowly starting to abandon this terminology, prokaryote, in favor of considering bacteria and archaea as very separate organisms. Because when you look at them at first under a microscope, from the outside, they look very, very, very similar. But when you start to study their DNA and the molecular functions going on, there are some significant differences. And again, biology teaches us more often than not never to judge a book by its cover, even at the microscopic level. Two things could appear to be exactly the same and end up being wildly different once you start to dig a little deeper. Now, if you're not prokaryotic, You are eukaryotic, right? And so these are the cells that we typically kind of think about when you hear the word cell. You think about all these crazy little things inside. And when you see or hear the word eukaryote, right? When you hear that you can think of you, right? So you are a eukaryotic organism. You're a multicellular eukaryote. You've got many cells, and your cell type would be eukaryotic, which means that you do have a nucleus, right? And so you've got this large central structure right here known as the nucleus. And inside of your nucleus, you have linear DNA, which means that your DNA is going to exist as kind of a longer chain and not circular like DNA. And we also have membrane-bound organelles, right? So eukaryotes have membrane-bound organelles, and you can see them all here. Some that we've talked about already would be the mitochondria and the chloroplast. So all these crazy baby organs floating around inside of this eukaryotic cell would allow the cell to carry out some pretty interesting functions. Now, like the prokaryotes, the eukaryotes have ribosomes, and their ribosomes are different. Eukaryotic ribosomes are ADS, right? And so although they have the same function, protein synthesis, they're slightly different. And the significance of this difference will become very apparent here in just a moment. Now, what are some characteristics? When you think about eukaryotes, you tend to assume they're going to be larger. They're much easier to look at under a microscope, and they tend to look complex. There's a whole lot more going on inside. And then eukaryotes can perform either asexual or sexual reproduction, and some organisms can bounce back and forth between the two forms of reproduction. And then eukaryotes can be unicellular or multicellular, okay? Whereas prokaryotes are always unicellular. Bacteria and archaea always exist as the individual cell. Now, they can live in colonies together, but each bacterium is its own organism. Whereas eukaryotes can be unicellular, like yeast, which is a fungi, or multicellular, like the tree that might be outside of your home. And so here are some examples. We got animals, plants, fungi, and protists. Now, I know you keep seeing this word protist, and you're thinking, what in the world is this? This is kind of a catch-all kingdom of organisms that would include things like paramecium, amoeba, algae, or something like Plasmodium falciparum, the little microbe that causes malaria. It's actually not mosquitoes. They just simply carry this protist. But we'll focus more on those later on in the semester. Now here we've got a prokaryote and a eukaryotic cell sitting side by side, and there is something I want to call your attention towards, and that's right here, right? Our little frame of reference in regards to size. Okay, this is a micrometer right here, so that's like a millionth of a meter, so we're talking really small. And prokaryotic cells are tiny, 0.1 to 10 micrometers, whereas eukaryotic cells could be anywhere from 10 to 100 micrometers. So your eukaryotic cells are going to be like 10 times as large as our prokaryotes. Okay, so much larger. And if you're looking at the two of them, you can definitely tell that the eukaryotic cell is going to be way more complex. Okay, now with the prokaryotic cells being smaller, this gives bacteria the ability to infect eukaryotic cells, right? So these prokaryotes can gain access to the inside of these cells, infecting them, causing disease. Or sometimes prokaryotes, bacteria, can adhere to the outside and secrete toxins, or they can simply float around inside of our bodies, right? So it makes sense that bacteria, the prokaryotes, are smaller than the hosts that they are infecting. And if you look really quickly, you can see that there are some similarities and there's some differences. Again, let's check off our similarities. I see plasma membranes, I see cytoplasm, I see DNA, and I see our ribosomes. You'll have to excuse the bell, I'm sorry. And then you can see some differences. Again, the prokaryotes have a nucleoid region, whereas the eukaryotic cell has a true nucleus. And here I've got this little classification chart, right? And so if you're studying an organism, the first question you'd ask yourself is, okay, is it prokaryotic or is it eukaryotic? So what if I said, okay, no nucleus, no organelles? then you would know by default it's prokaryotic. And since it's prokaryotic, you know it would be unicellular. And then your next step in identifying the cell would be trying to figure out, is it bacteria or is it archaea? Now, if you said, okay, I'm studying an organism and it does have a nucleus and it does have organelles, then I know it's a eukaryote. And then I would ask you, or maybe you'd ask me, or you'd ask another scientist, is it unicellular or is it multicellular? And if I said it's unicellular, then you would have to determine, is it a protist or is it type of fungus? And then maybe I said it's multicellular, and then you'd have to decide among these four.